Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Doing Well, the Wellbeing Science Insights Podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We're champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Lu Ngo, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Doing Well. And on this week's episode, we are talking about the importance of good leadership in times of crisis. And our guest today, Molly Castelloe, is perfect to talk about this topic. And I'll reveal why in a second. Molly Castelloe, Ph.D., is a filmmaker and psychoanalyst. She holds a doctorate in performance studies from New York University with a focus on theater and psychology. She is the producer and director of Blind Trust, an award-winning documentary film on group identity that has been shown at the Freud Museums in London and Vienna, at film festivals, and for the Youth Peace Initiative at The Hague. She has published articles about psychoanalysis and applied psychoanalysis for international journals and writes a blog for psychologytoday.com. Thank you so much for joining us today, Molly.
It's my pleasure, Lou.
Yeah, I know that it's evening for you, so we really appreciate that you're making the time to join the show. And also, I'm very curious because, at the beginning, I did say in your bio that you are the producer and director of a documentary. And, also you're a psychoanalyst. So it's kind of like something that people would not expect to hear. Quite unique. And I know that the documentary film is called, the full name is called Blind Trust, Leaders and Followers in Times of Crisis, which is sort of like today's topic that we're going to talk about in the podcast. So what was your film about? And can you share a bit more about that creative journey for you to actually produce it?
Yes. Well, the film, as you said, is called Blind Trust. And it's about the work of a man named Vamek Volkan, who is from Cyprus originally. He's a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst. And Lou, I don't know how much you know about Cyprus, but it's a divided island. In the north, it's divided to this day, but it's divided since the 60s, since the 1960s. And in northern Cyprus is where the Cypriot Turks live. And in southern Cyprus, it's where the Greeks live, the Greeks. So it's divided ethnically. And the man who was the subject of my film grew up there amid the warfare between these two ethnic groups. That's why the island's divided. And his name again is Dr. Vamek Volkan, and he's written a lot about group psychology. I think the part of the journey of the film was putting together his ideas with also the journey and story of his life, which is quite remarkable. While he was studying to be a psychiatrist in Ankara, Turkey, his roommate, who had gone back home to Cyprus to buy some medicine for his mother, was shot in a pharmacy and killed. He was shot 7 times and killed on the streets of Nicosia, which is the capital city of Cyprus. And that was part of the beginning of his ideas about large group psychology, because this roommate was killed it wasn't because of who he was personally. It was because he belonged to a certain group, and it was an enemy group. So part of, Dr. Volkan has written extensively about this, but it's in the film as well, that he began this process of mourning at that point of his life, and the development of certain ideas about groups He studied psychiatry and then came over to this country, to the United States, and studied to be a psychoanalyst in the South, actually where I grew up. And another sort of turning point in his life that's the beginning of in the early part of the film is he was inspired by Anwar Sadat, who, when he was the president of Egypt in 1979, went to the Knesset in Jerusalem and spoke and said that the majority of the problems between the Arabs and Israelis was a psychological wall. And that was a sort of a revolutionary idea. And he was assassinated shortly after that. But that way, I know that was very, very inspiring and for Dr. Volkan. And he began to work with the American Committee on Foreign Affairs here, that was sponsored by the American Psychoanalytic Association, to start studying groups. And he began working in the Middle East with Israelis and Palestinians, and bringing members of these groups, representatives or leaders, if you will, together for dialogue. So this is the subject of the film, his life and what he's done with this work. He's done this work for 40 years, bringing representatives of enemy groups together in traumatized areas of the world, in war zones, in places with warlike conditions, refugee camps. He spent some time in Northern Africa. This was a few decades ago, working with war orphans. So he's done work. Part of the basis of his sort of philosophy is going to a culture with a group of people that's interdisciplinary. He had developed, when he was over here at the University of Virginia, he developed a center there. It was called the Center for the Mind and Human Interaction. And it was it was a group of interdisciplinary scholars, leaders, civic leaders, historians and sociologists, as well as psychoanalysts. And his group went all over the world to these areas of conflict and worked bringing the two representatives or leaders of the two groups together for dialogue. And I feel like his work is just so of the moment today in the world, because, the world has gotten so crowded and there's been so much rapid development in technology and communication and travel, that in terms of refugees, there's the huge refugee crisis. So there's this crossing of borders, right, all over the world. And when there's crossing of borders, there's often a kind of threat to a group identity. If that nation state has kind of a totalistic identity rather than identity that he calls syncretic, which is made up of many different kinds of people. For instance, if you go to Greece, it's mostly a pride in being Greek and having the culture of being a Greek. Which means, you haven't asked me this question, but I know that one of the ideas that we're interested in is group psychology. And what is group psychology? And we're talking about it now, but the basis is really this concept. It's the main concept of Dr. Volkan's work, which is large group identity. And what that is people. This is his definition, and it's the film it covers this. It spends time sort of covering his life and his ideas, but it's a group identity. Large group identity is a group of people that share the same sentiments. They share the same culture, dances, food, often fairy tales. But the most important thing that they share is history, is a kind of history. And people will do many, many things to protect their large group identity. So often when borders are crossed, right, in the world we live in, there can be a threat to the large group identity of the host nation. Right. We see it very, one of our former presidents wanted to build a wall, right, to keep out the bad people, or, this is what we're talking about. This is the threat to large group identity, is responded to with wanting to seal up the nation state. So yeah, that's an important concept today, is large group identity, what it means, and what people will do to protect it, and how leadership, interfaces with the large group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's interesting, especially when we're talking about well-being. We don't really see it. Probably we don't notice it on a day-to-day basis, but it does affect us to a large extent. No matter if it's it's a community perspective, whether you're just engaging with your community and you have leadership within that community, or it could be a work context, right? So I think this conversation is applicable to a lot of different scenarios. So we'll discover that in more detail in a little bit. And before we do that, we have a part where we want to get to know our guest better. And that's called Have You Met Molly in this scenario? So we're going to get to know you better through some of the things that you love. The first thing we'd love to ask you is, what is your favorite book?
Well, is it a recent book or an old book? I have different favorites, but I'll tell you about a recent book that I've been reading. It's a book by Robert J. Lifton, who is also a psychiatrist, and he trained as a psychoanalyst, and people probably recognize him as a psychohistorian. But he is 98 years old now, and he has a new book out. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's written about he takes on, big topics, and he's written about Hiroshima and the survivors of Hiroshima. And he's written about, he has a book called The Nazi Doctors. And he's written more recently about climate change. But he has a book that came out this year called Surviving Our Catastrophes: Resilience and Renewal from Hiroshima to the COVID-19 Pandemic. And that's what I've been reading recently, and I've really enjoyed it. One of the main ideas from the book that I think it was illuminating for me, and I think it's very important. He spent a lot of time with survivors of catastrophes, of shared group trauma, is what it would be called. We'd call it shared trauma. And one of the main ideas he asserts in the book is that survivors are not just victims, that they have a special knowledge, because we have a psychic apparatus, right? Our psychology wants to make meaning of our life. And often, especially in trauma, we're overstimulated. And it's hard to put things together cohesively, because trauma is the moment that our mind shuts down. And that is so for the individual, and it's so for the group as well. So that's the experience that we're not able to integrate very easily. It's one reason people come to therapy or analysis. But his idea is that the people who are survivors have a special kind of knowledge, because they have much more incentive to make meaning of their lives because of what they've survived. And they have a special knowledge, and it's a knowledge that's valuable for others. So I thought that was a really important idea, and he develops that in this book. So that's what I've enjoyed reading most recently.
Yeah, definitely interesting. A new thing for me personally. Thank you for sharing that. What about a movie you've enjoyed recently?
Well, I tell you, I saw a wonderful film. It was done a few years ago, but by Richard Linklater, called Boyhood. I don't know if you know of that film.
I've heard of the name, yeah.
It's an interesting premise, because it's a beautiful film. And one thing that he did, which was so unusual, I'd never seen this done, is he had a script in mind that's really the script of his boyhood, of his growing up through adolescence from, say, elementary school to graduation of high school. And he had a script and he cast certain actors. They're wonderful. Ethan Hawke and Patricia Arquette play the parents of this boy. And what he did is I think he filmed them over a period of about 10 years. So you saw the actors change in the roles, which was a whole other layer of meaning in the drama. It was really a beautifully done film. There's another more recent film I've seen that I really enjoyed, and it was about the swimmer Nayad, from the woman who swam from Cuba to Florida. And she tried, I think it was her third attempt where she made it. But it was a very inspiring story about persistence and about unique capacities of a human when they're determined to accomplish a certain task.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, this was especially the first recommendation. I think someone talked about it recently as well. But then now that you're also talking about it, I definitely have to watch it. So yeah, good recommendation.
Certainly worth it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a lot of commitment too to film it over such a long period of time.
Sure was.
Yeah. So you're our podcast guest today. A fun fact about this show is some of our guests actually don't listen to podcasts. I don't know if you listen to podcasts yourself, and if you do, what's your favorite show?
Well, what I've enjoyed recently is a podcast that's sponsored by the International Psychoanalytical Association. It's called On and Off the Couch. And I recently heard a podcast about, it was more about focused on clinical work and people with trauma and a lot of guilt. And so it was about psychology again, individual psychology, but it's On and Off the Couch is the name of it.
Yeah, very interesting.
I'd recommend that too.
Yeah, cool. So I think for this question, I'm kind of I'm going to ask it slightly differently. So generally, we ask our guests if they have role models, but you made a whole documentary about, if I remember correctly, you said Dr. Vulcan.
Vulcan, Dr. Vulcan.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I wonder if that's because he's your role model, or if you have other role models you would like to talk about.
Yeah. Well, in a certain way, he has been a role model. I, growing up in the South of this country, I don't know how much you know about the history here, but there's still a big difference in the culture in the southern parts of the country and the rustic belt and the Northeast, also the West. But there's a big divide still between Northern and Southern cultures here. You've probably read in some of the popular media, people say that we're still reliving our Civil War. So he has been a kind of inspiration for me because as a kid, I knew very well growing up. I'm from Raleigh, North Carolina originally. And there was not segregation per se between whites and people of color, blacks, but there was social segregation. And I remember what that felt like as a kid. And I couldn't put words to it. It just felt like something that was strange and somehow unfair. So I think when I discovered his work, he's done so much to integrate polarized societies and nations, that has been a real inspiration. I also think his ideas are quite fascinating and relevant and timely today. So yes, he's been a big inspiration. I think Michelle Obama also was an inspiration, just to mention someone a little further afield from the work I'm usually involved in. But I think female leadership in this day and age is very important. So that's something I find inspiring.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you talk about, one male leader character and then one female leader character is important because, today we're going to talk more about leadership, and it's kind of exists in everyone to a certain extent. And I think it's good that we can learn from different role models.
Yes.
And finally, in this part, you probably have not taken a course in a while. Maybe you just took a course recently. I'm not sure because, each person is different. But I would love to know about a course you've taken. And this could be many years ago, it doesn't matter. But it's still really influential and you still remember and get inspiration from it to this day.
Oh my God. I feel like there's so many courses I've had that have felt that way. When I was looking over that question, there were a couple of things that came to my mind. Many of the courses that I'm taking these days are about, clinical work, which I find fascinating, but probably too technical for here, for the audience. I've really enjoyed also, I was thinking over decades, is writing groups. I feel like there's something very powerful and important about putting your own ideas and thoughts down on paper for anyone, and then sort of bringing that into a group that's supportive and hearing what other people hear in that and how they respond to that. So maybe that's particularly for people who journal, which I think is a great practice. Talking about daily practice, I think that's a great one to have. But writing groups and yeah. I took a course last year on adolescence and child psychology, and I thought that was quite wonderful. I would say before anyone, I do have a piece of advice that I think has been helpful for me. Before having a child, to learn about psychology, to learn about one's own psychology, and to learn about how we develop internally as individuals. I think we do not pay enough attention to the importance of mental health in this world.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a great point. Thank you. So now that we've got to know you a lot better, let's talk about today's topic. And I love that you covered some bits and bobs of it already. So this is going to make our conversation way easier. But because the show is about well-being, let's start broad and talk about well-being first to put things into context. So what does well-being mean to you personally, Molly?
I think it means having a good sense of self, and basically a sense that we are all internally good people, that there's something good about each of us. To feel that about oneself is what I'm saying. I think good attachments, having healthy emotional attachments to people. If it's not family, if you come from a place of a lot of conflict or difficulty or trauma, that you have other supportive, healthy, vitalizing attachments, however you create them. So I think healthy attachments, and a certain degree of awareness of our own personal histories and how it affects us in the present. I mean, maybe that's not an easy thing, and that's not something that we just do once, right? Hopefully we continue to return to that question of how childhood affects us in the present, in various ways, right? So I think having a degree of awareness and healthy outlets for expressing yourself,
Yeah.
constructive, creative outlets,
Yeah,
however you define that.
absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good point, and then a new perspective on the show. And then there was also this lingering question that we ask as well, because each person views well-being differently. So I guess in that context, and you briefly mentioned this before, like sometimes we don't even understand our own well-being and mental health, and that's kind of a whole journey in itself. And there are certain things that we think to be helpful for our well-being would actually be harmful. So we call them misconceptions broadly on this show. So I would love to know from your perspective, what do you think to be some of the biggest misconceptions that people tend to have about well-being?
Hmm. Well, I looked at that. One of the first things that came to my mind was well-being is not something we get external. I mean, it's not through objects or consumption. I guess the material is not through that kind of materialism that it's something we create internally in relation to others, but it's really it's an agency we have within ourselves to improve our lives, to make different choices, to feel freer, um, to feel more assertive, to feel that it's safe, um, to be assertive. So I'm not sure if that's really an answer to your question. I think I have to think a little bit more about that. It's a good question. Do you have other thoughts about it? Maybe if we get into a dialogue, we could sort of stimulate more discussion around it. Could you say more about misconceptions and how the show defines it?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, on the show, we've got quite a few ones. So, for example, well-being doesn't mean you have to be well all the time. It fluctuates, and
Mhm.
when your well-being is not so good, that's when you actually learn more about how to work on your own well-being. And I think that's kind of related to your point earlier.
Mhm.
So, for
Mhm.
example, when you talk about, before you have a child, you actually learn the psychology of yourself and your and a child. I think that's really important. And a lot of people, to me personally, this is something that is kind of recent to me. A lot of people, including some of my friends, think that their well-being will be improved once they have a family and a child.
Okay.
That is not true.
Mhm.
Because I know this because I talked to one of my friends recently, and she's had her first child. She just had her first child a few months ago, and everything seemed fine on the surface. Seems like her well-being is great, but when we actually had a conversation, she said, "Don't get married, just have fun. Don't have a kid yet. It's very complicated." And that just showed me that she wasn't mentally ready, and that affected her well-being overall, right? So I think there are just so many misconceptions people have, and that's one of the points that I realized based on what you shared on the show earlier. But obviously, you probably have different interactions. You talk to different people, so you would notice other things too.
Mhm. Well, you're right. That's a fantasy. I mean, I guess what you're talking about too is certain fantasies that people have that are not the reality. You're right. This idea that you're going to make up for things when you have your child, that's so ironic because we repeat the things with our child that were done to us.
Yeah.
We either repeat them directly or we repeat the opposite of them. But it becomes hard to see subtleties and gradations. So that's a wonderful example of what you were saying. Um, I think it reminded me of another one. This idea that people have that history doesn't matter, that their own personal history really doesn't matter. It's related, but that your childhood doesn't impact who you are for the rest of your life. I mean, I feel like one of the real benefits of analysis is that it gives you a huge range of choices then because you're aware of how you're taking certain actions based on your history, based on being fearful of a critical parent, of being unheard or somehow shamed, perhaps. Um, we don't realize how much those experiences affect us for the rest of our lives. And the good news is that there's ways to be aware of it so that we have different choices. So we don't marry our mother or father and repeat the same patterns. So I think that's a good point. These misconceptions or fantasies, right, that are really different from what the reality is.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very true. I mean, if we go into detail, there would be so much more. But I think it's a really good one that I kind of got the inspiration from. From what you said earlier, because I do realize that a lot of people of my age group, or maybe even a little bit younger or older, they're kind of thinking that, like, having settling down, having a family, having a child, that will solve all of their problems and life will be better. But in fact, not really. If you think about the context of well-being, that might actually be detrimental to your well-being if you're not mentally, physically, financially ready. So yeah, it's just a lot happening.
Yeah. In a certain way, it intensifies all of those issues that you grew up
Absolutely.
with. Because then
Exactly.
you're the person who needs to provide, and you're the supposed adult.
Yeah,
So it can make
absolutely.
for a real sort of
Yeah.
crisis too.
Yeah, definitely. So today we are talking about something that is slightly different from what we just discussed, but also still under the umbrella of well-being. So, good leadership in times of crisis. And I think that the preface of this topic is based on your background in psychology, and especially in group psychology. You briefly mentioned that in the beginning. So I guess, we've already got the understanding of group psychology out of the way. We sort of know what it's about. But I think it would be important to understand a little bit more, because we're talking about times of crisis. That means there might be trauma. So, in that context, how should we view collective trauma?
Well, it's very interesting. So let's talk about just what collective trauma is.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, it can come from many different sources. Often other humans, right, in terms of war or attack. Um, it can also come from natural disasters, earthquakes, tsunamis, nature today. But I wanted to speak particularly about human inflicted trauma. Um, Dr. Volkan has talked about this in terms of trauma by the hands of an enemy. And what happens, for instance, with something like what happened with the Holocaust, was that a group of people has a shared feeling about the event. And trauma, the experience of trauma for the individual and the group always involves a feeling of helplessness, and overwhelm, like we were talking about before. And often when that trauma, is not assimilated into the personality, it keeps revisiting the person and coming back, like a flashback or PTSD. So one of the things that happens in relation to shared group trauma is, the event that can't be contained or worked through or mourned because it's so overwhelming is passed on to the children. Speaking of children, by the way, um, there's been much of the work of Dr. Volkan and people working in group psychology, but particularly this kind of work, psychoanalytic work, and Dr. Volkan's work is based on clinical work with Holocaust survivors and their descendants, interviews and clinical work. So these people have studied the transgenerational transmission of trauma and how that happens from adult to child with something like the Holocaust. So, the child then sort of picks up bits and pieces of this story and this experience, right, through cues, unconscious cues, or stories, often stories or just secrets, right? Often there's a secret, the secret hasn't been told, because the parents have felt ashamed of that trauma. But the kid always picks up bits and pieces anyway, and it's confusing, but they try and put it together. That's one of the things that happens with group trauma, is that it's often passed on because it's so overwhelming and it's really impossible to mourn fully. Uh, I don't know if that answered all of what your the other question. There was another component to what you asked about, group trauma, and were you wondering about leadership? Should we go on to leadership, or did you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
I think it's a good place to start because we are trying to understand, leadership in times of crisis.
Right. Right.
When it comes to
Yes.
crisis, we've talked about collective trauma. So now let's
Yes.
talk about leadership.
Yes.
So in that context, especially for well-being, how would you view good leadership?
Yes. Well, one capacity that's often overlooked in good leadership, and I mean, it depends on what kind of leadership. We've been talking about. I mean, I'm thinking about what I go over, what the film shows is a president of a country. And one thing that a good leader like that does, that's often overlooked, is a good leader is able to help his people mourn, and come to terms with a historic trauma that they've endured. Uh, a good leadership is also a very good listener, I think, and is able to listen like Mandela could, like Nelson Mandela, listen to two sides. And, he was remarkable in the way that he could work symbolically to help, like through rugby, for instance, through the rugby sports, help two sides come together and play. So another thing a good leader does is help his people have outlets for play and for that kind of creativity. So I think these are good qualities of a leader: helping people to mourn, being able to listen, helping the people that you're leading also have some aspect of play in their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's important. It's actually hard to achieve because I think, especially when people in leadership positions, they're overwhelmed. It's just kind of like, okay, we have to push forward, move forward, get past things, move on to the next problems. And so it's actually quite hard to find that balance of, okay, let's reflect on what happened. Let's hear from both sides, or, get all the views before we move on to the next thing and the next thing. And I think that's why we kind of need to understand the context of group psychology better, especially for leaders, I think, because when you mention all these things about collective trauma and how people feel and how people respond, I realized that, perhaps a lot of leaders don't really pay attention to this. I might be wrong, but
No,
I think that's the case.
I think you're exactly right, and I think it's a problem with leadership that our leaders don't have more psychological awareness. I mean, one of the things I think I don't want to miss what we talked about: a good leader, but I also want to talk about a bad or malignant leader. What that and there's a scene. It was actually the inspiration for the film that I made.
Yeah.
If I could speak briefly about it. And Dr. Volkan wrote about this. This is in a chapter in one of his earlier books, which he called Bloodlines, which was about ethnic pride and ethnic terrorism. And in the former Yugoslavia, um, he writes about the war, the Bosnian War and the Yugoslav War, and the president of the time was Milosevic. And there's a scene in the film where what he did was on the anniversary of a historic battle, which was a group trauma for the Serbs, it was the Battle of Kosovo, from 1389. That's when the battle took place. And what he did to motivate and rally people to war, his people, the Serbs, was he gave a speech at the site of this historic battle, and he called up the collective memory of this battle on the 600th anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo. And this was also this was his rallying speech at Kosovo. This is used as an illustration of a dramatic elaboration of a malignant leader who created a genocide. And what bad leaders often do is they call up the memory of a trauma in their people in order to create an enemy and to incite a retaliation and revenge. And I mean, we've seen a version of that here in this country, in a call to reclaim a lost greatness. It's the idea of we're going to get back what we lost. ages ago, decades ago, centuries ago. We're going to get that back now. Dr. Volkan calls that chosen trauma. That a certain trauma is chosen to represent the group. This happened to us. The Battle of Kosovo of 1389. This happened to us. We remember it now. You're bringing it back to our awareness, and we feel it again. Actually, it's a fascinating term. Dr. Volkan calls it time collapse.
Yeah.
We feel the trauma all over again, and it motivates us to get revenge.
Yeah. So I think it's good that you mentioned that, because that raises an interesting point. Sometimes it could be good leadership in disguise, or it could be the other way around, because if anyone or if a group of people collectively get motivated to do something, that might raise the point that, oh, that must be a good leader. But in fact, that good leadership is leading to a bad result. So it's not really good leadership, isn't it?
You get caught up. It's interesting that what you're saying, because it's easy for any of us to get caught up in a group mentality. And what happens is, with that kind of circumstance, with a malignant leader who's invoking a memory of trauma in order to create time collapse, right? So that the people feel they're back there again, and they've got to, create an other. You get swept up, and what happens is that group identity becomes more important than individual identity. Freud wrote about this also. Individual identity becomes lost, and there's the loss of critical thinking. So that's the blurring that you're talking about. I guess you may think you're swept up. Everybody's swept up in this. We must be doing the right thing. But it's a kind of shared group fantasy.
Yeah, definitely.
That's destructive, that often leads to destruction, or kind of a cleansing, an ethnic cleansing or cultural cleansing of another that's created in the mind of this group.
Yeah.
So
which is sort of what's happening in the world right now. So
you bet. And I mean, it's happened here and some other places for sure. But that's something that people, I think, can be more aware of when it's happening, or develop certain. Another important quality of well-being is the ability to reflect, just to be able to reflect and self-reflect. I think that's not given enough value and credence often.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, totally. And I think, in the process of making your documentary, your film, you've done a lot of studies into this area. So is there any other insight that you would like to share with us when it comes to, let's say, groups, or maybe leadership, or even, the combination, the relationship between both areas?
There is another sort of main idea. It's a main idea of Dr. Volkan's work. It's a main idea in the film, and it's the importance of mourning and shared mourning. I talked about this early experience of mourning when Dr. Volkan's roommate was killed, and he has written a lot about grief and pathological grief and difficulties in grief, complications in it. I think we probably don't pay enough attention as individuals to the importance of mourning and of group mourning. I mean, that's what these memorials, and so often we build monuments and memorials for this. But I think the process of grieving and the importance of shared mourning, it was a subject that came up for Germany after World War II. And there was a book written by two psychoanalysts called The Inability to Mourn, about Germany after World War II. So I think this is just another important theme. It's also in Dr. Volkan's work and in the film is the importance of finding new ways to mourn. After the catastrophes that we've had in the last 2 centuries, especially the 20th century.
Yeah. So I think that raises another question, and probably the last question in this part, because there's, there are a few different things that you covered. Obviously, there's a lot to navigate in this space, and things that people probably didn't think about, mourning being one of those. So in times of crisis, I think the role of leader is the toughest one, and also the most important role. And there are so many things that they should look out for. And I think one of the points you mentioned earlier is the fact that we need to understand our own mental health, our own psychology, to maintain that level of well-being. And I do think that, you did say a few points that pointed out that, it's definitely super important for leaders to maintain that level of mental health and well-being, to be able to guide people through a crisis. This could be any types of crisis, and probably not as intense as the one that have been mentioned in your film, or maybe some of the other examples we've given. But I think it's important for leaders to understand how to, navigate through the space when it's already tough for everyone, including themselves, so they can maintain that certain level of mental health to lead people and guide people through a crisis. So what would be some strategies that leaders themselves can adopt to do this?
Mm-hmm. Well, I was thinking about, when you're leading a group and there's fragmentation, I think the worst thing for a leader to do is to create more polarization in the group that they're leading. So the leader needs to be able to integrate and to help people integrate. I think a leader also, we were talking about well-being before, and this is for the individual as well as the leader, have a certain level of frustration tolerance, right? Where they can keep a cool mind, and a level-headedness, rather than, working through the emotions and inciting greater emotions in the people. That could lead to, an enemy or a war or fighting and more conflict. So I think having a cool mind about things and being able to wait, frankly, being able to wait and to think. So these are some of the best, I think, these are the qualities of best leaders. We have these kind of characteristics.
Yeah, definitely. So now let's go into something a bit more practical. So you've mentioned a few things that leaders can nurture, to get there. But let's say someone has been listening to this conversation. They're kind of going, okay, I'm in a leadership position. My people are going through crisis. I need to adopt something like a practice that I can try today, so that I can be a better leader. So what would be that practice that you recommend? Perhaps something that you do yourself.
Well, this is something that comes up in the clinical context. And it's an idea I'm taking from psychoanalysis and clinical work. But when there's conflict or tension in the group you're leading, it's important to have a third party. In psychoanalysis and clinical work, we call it the third. It's not one person. It's not the other side either. It's a place in between, and it's usually, practically speaking, it's often a consultant, hopefully somebody who knows a lot about group psychology, who can come in and help you and help create a kind of third space. I think that's not probably paid attention to often enough, the importance of a third space for sort of stabilizing the group. Yeah, I think also, listen, I just practically speaking, scheduling times where you listen to the people you're leading. You listen and can take in what they're saying, and can also understand and help them understand, and develop strategies for coping with whatever their conflict is. But I think being able to listen in that kind of context on a regular basis is important as a practice.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
and Well, I mean, the other thing, I know we've talked a lot about it, but I think just the importance of keeping an awareness of the history of the group that you're leading.
Mm.
Whoever the former leaders were, whatever the past of the group was, if you're not creating something new, I think because people will often still be responding to that, even in a group. If what happened to the last leader,
Yeah.
whatever happened, did he leave? Was he fired or assassinated or what happened? People will be responding to that. So I think an awareness of the people's history in your group
Hmm.
is
Yeah.
important to keep in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think it's always easy to walk into a new group, especially, and be like, I'm going to use all these strategies to help these people. They seem to be in crisis, especially with teams that have troubles finding managers. I heard this from my friend the other day. She said, I joined the company, and the second day I joined, the manager left, and then there's another manager
Mhm,
that
mhm,
just took over but didn't know what they were
mhm,
doing.
mhm,
And so I think it's so true that you were saying understand the history of the group, knowing what they have been through to navigate that better. And that's actually something that probably we don't think about. Like even people that are on the receiving end of leadership, right? And I think
mhm.
having that conversation as well to kind of flip this part a little bit. We're talking about practice that leaders can adopt, but at the same time, I think it's important to have the voice of the people being led. They can come and
That's
say,
you got
yeah,
if you want them to follow, you have to
yeah,
be able to listen to what they want. And
yeah.
what I mean, that's it. Yeah, I mean, we have to talk about different styles of leadership then, because we don't want a tyrant, right? Who just goes with their own plan. It's important
Yeah.
to listen as a leader.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Very important point. And I think that's a good practice. So yeah. And again, I think from the other end, if you're the one being led, you always can be brave and speak up as well. That's important because sometimes I think it is true. Leaders need to listen, but sometimes they unknowingly forget to do so because they've been caught up in other things. It's a really difficult space to navigate. So yeah, I think having people being led to come to the leaders and
Yeah.
express how they want to be led would also be important.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a very good point. It's important to speak up if you are being led and you're not being led where you want to where you want to go, to speak
Yeah.
up. And what you're doing often is you might be expressing a frustration that others are feeling, but they don't
Yeah.
have the courage to say. And once one person says it, there's often a sense of relief that
Hmm.
somebody has voiced what
Yeah.
this group has been struggling with.
Yeah.
A leader that takes
Absolutely.
them down a rabbit hole.
Yeah. Definitely. That's a good reminder to us all. So thank you for that. And that sort of closes out our practice section. And before we let you go, we've got open mic. And I know that we discussed this briefly before we started the conversation. So I know that you've got something you would like to share with our audience. So take it away, Molly.
Well, we've been talking a lot about the film, and so yes, I'm excited about the film. There was a screening yesterday in South London that went very well. Um, it's a film that I think is of interest of any sort of general population who is curious and intelligent, inquisitive about group psychology, about how we are led, and about individual psychology, and then transgenerational transmission of trauma. Um, and the film has a website, and it's blindtrust.tv. um, the film is available for educational purposes too, for libraries, and it has a distributor, an educational distributor, and that's Bullfrog Films. You can just Google that, Bullfrog Films. They have a lot of different documentary films on subjects like this and climate change as well. So those are two websites I wanted to mention. We've been doing community screenings too for people who are working in diplomacy or conflict resolution. And we did a screening at the UN for International Day of Peace in September. So yes, I invite people to visit the website and read reviews or find out more about the film.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing, and lovely to hear about the film, and especially since it got screened so recently, and it sounds like a wonderful one. So we'll make sure to check out the film, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Lu. My pleasure to be here.
You have been listening to Doing Well, the Wellbeing Science Insights Podcast, produced by the Wellbeing Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website, we.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Lu Ngo. Thanks for tuning in.